Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from, and thanks for being here. Today's session is all about AI and critical infrastructure and how they intersect with each other, and what we need to do to keep things and the systems running in our day-to-day life. This particular session, we're going to spend a lot of time to talk about critical infrastructure and the intersection of critical infrastructure and AI in 2025 and beyond. We'll try to keep this session very practical, engaging, and we will focus on real world impacts. We're not going to spend a lot of time just to do a bit of a tech talk. Isn't it, Edwin?
Absolutely, you got it right.
So let's dive in and keep it practical, relevant, and a little bit of fun. A little bit about myself. My name is Sanjay Verma. I have spent over 30 years working across 5 continents, helping organizations protect the systems which really matters most. Along the way, I've picked a bunch of certifications, kind of like fridge magnets. Everyone knows what fridge magnets are. But what really matters are the lessons that I have learned over the last 3 decades. And using those lessons to talk about those lessons in this particular forum. So today's session is all about sharing those insights in a simple, in a practical manner. No jargon. We will try our best to not use any jargon, just real stories and some useful takeaways from this particular session. And I'm thrilled to be joined by my co-presenter, Edwin Singh, who brings great experience from the public sector. Over to you, Edwin.
Radio. Sure. My name is Edwin. I'm a security domain lead in the SIS office at Inland Revenue, which if you're in Australia, it's your ATO or your tax department within your relevant countries. I bring I guess, a good background and understanding of AI governance, information security across the ecosystem and sectors. I've worked in multiple areas such as finance, transport, government, telecommunications, and so on. I'm also a PECB professional trainer as well. And as Sanjay has mentioned, you've got your own magnet bags down the bottom there. So obviously certified into that context as well. So today we're going to have a session around critical infrastructure and what does AI mean in that context as well. And we'll talk a bit about what does it actually mean from a stats perspective in the ecosystem as well. So looking forward for the session. Over to you, Sanjay. Yeah.
Thank you, Edwin. Here is the roadmap of our session. We'll start with the fundamentals of critical infrastructure, what it means, the threat that critical infrastructure faces in 2025 and beyond, and how artificial intelligence, and we're going to use the acronym called AI moving forward, and everyone knows exactly what AI is. And we'll talk about what are the strategies that we need to put into place and put into practice in real world to stay resilient. Now, think about this particular session as we go through over the next 50 minutes or 55 minutes that we have got left. We'll talk about the basics, we'll dive into some juicy stuff, we'll talk about threats, we'll talk about resilience, and finally, we'll wrap up the session by talking about what it means to human beings, assuming that we are still in charge. So as long as people who have joined this particular session don't see as a deep fake Sanjay and deep fake Edwin, we'll try to make it as realistic as possible. So why don't we start with the fundamentals and basics of critical infrastructure? And let's talk about what critical infrastructure is. Now, Edwin, what do you think, in your opinion and based on your experiences, how do you see critical infrastructure?
Critical infrastructure in our context here in New Zealand, it's about resiliency, and it's about society itself, right? Able to continue to function when there is a scenario where there could be a disaster, and we just need to continue to operate from a well-being perspective, such as certain government agencies, transportation, the healthcare, banking and finance, etc., to continue, I guess, the bare minimum that we need to continue to survive in that context, rather than basically the wants rather than the needs at this particular stage, right? And making sure that the needs are fulfilled. And the biggest thing over there is power industry, water, utilities, and so on. So, and it's pretty much the context from my perspective. Over to you, Sanjay.
Yeah, from an Australian government point of view, and we'll spend a little bit of time to talk about SOCI Act here in Australia, and the Australian government has designated 11 sectors as part of the critical infrastructure. And when we talk about all those terminologies around critical infrastructure, we used to think infrastructure as being boring, traditional. It sounds very boring. It sounds like, bricks and mortars or maybe steel fences, but now it's cool. And it's not the only thing that we think about from a critical infrastructure point of view that is going to stop a toaster from becoming a botnet soldier. Yeah, because we have got all the devices in today's world which is connected to a thing called internet.
Internet, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the protection of those critical infrastructure is getting much more serious and concerning from a business point of view. And when we talk about critical infrastructure, we talk about our ecosystem, we talk about communications, we talked about health services, we talked about water, we talked about all the other information you can see on this slide. Now, there are different sectors, but there is something that is common across all the sectors. It's all about interconnectedness. Would you agree? And the interdependence between all the different sectors. What do you think, Edwin?
Absolutely, and understanding that is quite important, right? Your entire ecosystem. There are, from an agency perspective, government agencies are also dependent on other agencies, right? And how that whole ecosystem then intertwines into that construct. So it's quite important to understand your dependencies. For example, transportation. National critical infrastructure, what could possibly go wrong in transportation? You could be out of fuel. Is fuel class as critical infrastructure? Is the oil and gas industry one of those things that's critical as part of that process? So same as in the transportation from a train railway perspective, right? Is power one of the key sources in order to continue to function public transport? So we need to think about those interdependencies as part of the process. So, and when we go into that, we talk about the specific types, right? And those specific types, we just specifically here on the screen here, we're talking about 3 ones here, which is the energy sector, which I talked about, oil, gas, and those particular resources to continue to operate what needs to operate, because it's quite a core function of how we operate, and from a well-being perspective, transportation is very critical. And then that supports, the energy sector supports transportation, as well as communication networks are supported by the energy sector. So those interconnectivities are quite there, and they're quite real. That one sector, say for instance, the energy sector fails, then obviously you're going to have situations where the communication networks and communication sector would also fail in that context. So having understanding of the interdependencies all throughout the whole ecosystem is very important. And yeah, Sanjay?
Cascading effect. Something goes wrong in one part of the infrastructure, one industry, one sector, it has got a cascading effect on the other part of the industry.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that understanding is not very well known, and it's quite important to understand that, right? That, hey, look, something doesn't work here is because something happened here down the train, upstream or downstream effects of what that looks like.
Yeah, and global threat is complex. So when you look at the global threat landscape and the importance of critical infrastructure, we talk about the economic impact of critical infrastructure. We rely on critical infrastructure from national economy point of view. We have got social dependencies on the critical infrastructure, and we can't ignore the fact that in this DNA, in the world we live in right now, there is a significant relevance from a national security point of view. And working in the public sector, Edwin, there is nothing else that I can say apart from the fact that it's very critical for national security.
Yes, absolutely, Sanjay. National security is quite important to everyone in every country that's out there, right? And understanding that and protecting that infrastructure is also, I guess, essential to the lifestyle we are in, right? And making sure that social dependencies are there. And then what is the economic impact of that? So you can also go from 1 to 2 to 3, or you can go from 3 to 2 to 1, the other way around as well, to have a look at what that looks like. So I think well-being is quite an important thing. The social dependency is very important. It's probably one of the ones that has the most heavy weight in here to making sure that people's well-being is taken care of as part of the core services that's provided by critical infrastructure. And I think that when threats come in, how do we make sure that we have the level of assurance as a society that our utility services and so are doing the right things to protect that as well? Over to you, Sanjay. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, we spent a couple of minutes to talk about the basics of critical infrastructure. We talked about the interconnectedness. We talked about the relevance of critical infrastructure, either from a national security point of view, to make sure that my coffee machine is working. Cool? I don't want anyone to go into my coffee machine and stop me from making my coffee first thing in the morning. That will be disastrous for me as a human being. So, as we talked about this, I'm sure that you drink coffee. We talked about the basics and the fundamentals of critical infrastructure. Now, we can bring our subjective opinion to talk about what critical infrastructure is and why critical infrastructure is such an important topic in today's world. But let's try to justify the statement that we have just made over the last 5 minutes and talk about some data. And we talked about artificial intelligence, and we'll slowly talk about artificial intelligence. How do we justify based on the data we have got? And
Sure, yeah.
Yes, isn't it? What do you think looking in front of your screen?
Sure, these are the stats. This is what's going on in the entire ecosystem of critical infrastructure, right? 80% of them are targeted on a daily, monthly, weekly hours view. It's ongoing, the level of threats that are going out there. And I think that also ties into the non-compliance. We've seen a lot of critical infrastructures around, I need to serve the social well-being of people and citizens within our country, etc. And then compliance and non-compliance comes the second factor, right? It's about getting that in there. So how do we make sure that there's a good balance of, I need a good level of compliance and the other a sector in that particular place, so that we can help reduce some of those targets. And what does it look like, right? We know that denial of service is one of those things. The DDoS attacks, they happen quite often. We've seen an increase in that in critical infrastructure than normal agencies as a common element. And some of the common incident types that we've seen is compromised accounts, right? Phishing exercises, email phishing exercise to get understanding of that, infecting machines through malware as well as another scenario, and then compromised assets, right? Critical infrastructure is dependent on critical assets, right? Physical assets, physical systems, more than software-based systems. So understanding that as well. And I think what the critical thing here is that that all has a dependency, as in from compromised account perspective, is how it leverages itself in the tiering. The most frequently reported I guess from critical infrastructure perspective has been the education side, electrical side, and other areas like transport and so on. But what's been interesting recently is that if you did or have got any statistics around this or have seen any statistics around this, is that core ministry agencies, core government entities and sectors are targeted at a percentage of say 30%, and you'd see critical infrastructure as 39%, right? It's further up the chain. So you're seeing more I guess, malicious activities in critical infrastructure than you are seeing in general agencies and general ministries across the board, and what we've seen in the report so far. What do you think about that, Sanjay? You want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, the number that we can see on the screen is a shocker, because when you think about it, just touched the start on the critical infrastructure, and if you look into the stats here, 80% of the critical infrastructure has been impacted, and they have been impacted by email-related breaches. And these are states coming from Australian Signals Directorate, cyber.gov.eu, AU, and the other sources which are at the bottom of the slide. We have been talking about email issues for decades, isn't it? I remember we have been talking about email issues back in the early days, before we talked about Microsoft Windows operating systems, when we were using Lotus notes. Yeah, it's still relevant, and this is not a statistic. There is a red flag waiting on somewhere. And the data that we can see on this particular slide is very clear. The infrastructure has faced email-related breaches, and then we have a striking 65% of operations that do not meet regulatory requirements. And I think that is going to keep all of us awake at night, even the execs at the top of the food chain. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely agree there. I think that's I think there are challenges. Organizations will have challenges on how they would interpret compliance, non-compliance, and I think making sure they're getting the right expertise as part of that process as well, and also making the right call from a risk perspective around what areas of a non-compliance. There's going to be a scenario where nothing can be 100%, right? And just having an understanding of what that 80-20% rule looks like, if that's the case out in Australia. But over here, it's some of the same question: what can we meet, what can't we meet? And we understand those risks. But the fact that the non-compliance at 65% is non-accepted risk that we know and understand that is a bit alarming, yeah.
Yeah, and protection in today's age is not about just something that nice to have. It's a must-have from an organization point.
Yeah.
We're talking about from ransomware to system vulnerabilities. We are talking about the cost from an attack point of view, which demands the need for protection on critical infrastructure because systems are vulnerable. And just to talk about something on the softer side here, Edwin, back in the early days, I was practicing on something called Kali Linux. Everyone knows what Kali Linux is. You can buy, or you don't have to buy. You can buy Raspberry Pi, and this is a Kali Linux tool that you can download free of cost. And I was executing an nmap command just on one of my websites. And guess what I did? I created a denial of services attack. And as an end user, well, what I've realized is that there are vulnerabilities. There are gaps in everything that we do. And the critical infrastructure are exposed to the threats. And these threats could be natural disaster, it could be cyber attacks, it could be physical attacks on the critical infrastructure. And there is a need for protection. What do you think, Edwin? What do you think? Infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing. There's a saying: there's no silver bullet, right? So we need to understand that context of what that looks like. So the importance of protection could also be, as part of my critical infrastructure, what is the critical components of that critical infrastructure that I need to put defense in depth in, right? And an understanding of that defense in depth. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of the non-compliance comes through, is that not putting the layers in place to protect ourselves or those industries, to make sure that make it a bit harder for someone to do something and not so easy to do something. So having a look at that from an ecosystem perspective, and then making sure that lessons learned. One of the other things as part of the need for protection is sharing the knowledge, right? And working through, as a critical infrastructure, collaboration and efforts around collaboration between each of the sectors to talk about, hey, look, we've noticed this in the last month, we've noticed this, what have you done about it? Or, oh, that's interesting. We would like to learn from that, so that we can learn from those user cases and those lessons learned, so we can increase and improve ourselves continuously. And the continuous improvement is very important as part of the process, right? What do you think about that, Sanjay, about continuous improvement, and how do we make sure we continue that collaboration and that effort across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a need for collaboration, and we need to understand that cyber attackers, they don't break in, they're logging into the systems. And the systems could be controlling our power plant, the systems could be controlling our water supply, the systems could be controlling anything. And usually cyber criminals, they log into the systems using the credential that may be sitting in someone's OneDrive or Dropbox. Yeah. And there is a need for collaboration, and we'll talk about a few aspects from a collaboration point of view, Edwin. The most important aspect for us to understand here is why critical infrastructure is becoming a #1 priority in the current global climate. And we need to be mindful of the global landscape of all the threats. And some of the threats that we are going to discuss at very, very high level is talk about the geopolitical tensions. And there are geopolitical tensions across the planet, and we have seen an exponential growth of the geopolitical tension, terrorism, and cyber warfare in the last few years. Edwin, anything that you would like to add here?
Yes, and I think the trends are quite important to understand, because there is, I think, as part of the geopolitical tensions, those trends sometimes are quite common. common trends across each country. There are common threats across that whole critical infrastructure. It's just like targeting each and opposites in that space, but making sure there's disruption. It's all about making sure there's disruption, right, as part of that process. So how do you make sure that we safeguard that from and making sure that we've got the right things in place? And again, it comes down to the key concept around a couple of things that we'll talk about today is around the defense in depth and other things like that, right?
Yeah, and if you think about all the global landscape from a threat point of view, that have gone pro.
Mm.
They are running, the threat actors are running this as if they are running a startup company. And the geopolitical situation has gone digital. And we're not paranoid. And we don't have to be paranoid, but we need to be prepared. And we need to be prepared so that we understand the informed decision that we need to make to keep our system running and keep our business functioning. And as we talk about, we will touch base at a very, very high level on the cybersecurity threats. And at one stage, I saw a computer critical infrastructure in a manufacturing plant I was visiting for security review, and it was running Windows XP, and I aged 10 years in 10 seconds.
Oh, yes. Yep, absolutely. And it is one of those things, right? There are going to be, I guess, one of those scenarios where assets are older than expected, and using some of those older OS and older systems to continue to operate. That is one of those things that, you know, is always there in critical infrastructure, to be honest. And then it's just putting those layers in, right? How do we put those layers in from those threats perspective, right? And you've got here recent attacks and breaches. You know, what are the I guess the things that are illustrated apart, the common patterns, right? Common patterns where the collaboration, sharing around the common patterns around the sectors can absolutely help. And also the legacy systems, what I talk about, you know, what you talked about just there, the lack of security updates and exposing critical infrastructure risks, and what are the layers you need to put in. The cost of data loss is quite important too, right? Financial damage and breaches, you know, what are the things like SOCI Act, for an example? If there was a breach, you know, is there a fine? You know, these are things we need to consider, and there are things that either, you know, C-suite or execs have accepted a level of, I guess, risk tolerance on. But I guess it comes back down to, again, all of those things from recent attacks and breaches to the cost of data loss, all can come down to, you know, legacy systems, you know, still the easy systems to be able to have those level of breaches to come through, and how you can make sure you've got that protection in place. So I think that's quite key that you've circled that out, and lack of updates and exposing the risks associated with that, Sanjay.
I read an article, and that report 2023, and it clearly says that most of the largest scale breaches in 2023 were linked to unpatched or legacy systems. And that wasn't the only issue that was reported in the report. The report also talked about people and people who are untrained. And when people are untrained, we need to now move away from the traditional way of thinking into AI ways of thinking. AI is the biggest helper, but at the same time, it could potentially be the worst roommate. And when you think about AI, it does everything. And cyber risk, when you look at critical infrastructure from an AI point of view, we are not just talking about impersonation. We're not talking about just deepfakes. We are not looking at the supply chain vulnerabilities. But with the evolution of artificial intelligence and the invention and the growth of AI that we have seen over the last few years, now we need to be careful about the poisoning of the AI models, the data models. We need to look into how these AI models are getting the information using what I call it the RAG systems, or what we call in the AI space is the RAG systems, and also look into the system prompt leakage from those AI systems. And when you look at the physical threats, from a critical infrastructure point of view, physical threats plays a very critical role. And then you have already touched base on the importance of critical infrastructure, and you also mentioned about SOCI Act, and you would agree, Edwin, that when we talk about SOCI Act, when we talk about other acts across the planet, there is a lot of emphasis that we have to pay on the physical aspect of it, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So we talk a bit about that in that context, right? And I think with aging infrastructure, it definitely struggles to meet, I guess, appropriate standards moving forward, right? And how do we make sure that that is advocated all the way through, and how do we make sure we do that? And I think it comes back to a couple of fundamentals around aging infrastructure also, and legacy systems are secure by design, right? Secure by privacy, secure by resiliency, making sure that we have, if we are having legacy systems, how do we make that more resilient, right? What are the things that we need to think about as part of that process, right? And again, comes down to what are the direct threats that we have associated with that aging infrastructure? Then what are the other significant risks that we need to cater for as part of that downstream, upstream effect, right? So I think it's quite important that we continue to understand that context a bit better and continue to make sure that we build relevant systems with defense in depth, yeah?
We use the term called resilience, and let's, just like we talked about what is critical infrastructure, let's get back into the resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And you have touched on a very, very sensitive topic when we talk about resilience, because traditionally we have thought about resilience as something which we need to do as part of our compliance requirements to keep the systems up and running. But resilience in today's world, with the evolution of AI, is more than just surviving. And it's looking good while we're doing it. And also, the systems are getting impacted by ransomware. The systems are getting impacted by cyber espionage, nationist-sponsored attacks, and everything that is going on in the world these days. And resilience is not about just bouncing back because we want to keep our business up and running, but also it's about thinking about the future and anticipating any failure and adapting in the relevant situation as quickly as possible so that we are ready, we are prepared. And going back to the point that you said, is about putting the design principles as we are building our systems and as we are building our business model.
Yeah, can you still hear me, Sanjay? Sorry, I've got a webcam issue here, but as long as you can hear me, that's the main thing. Cool. Yes, no, totally. And I think, one of the key things here is embracing change effectively, right? I'd like you to highlight that, right? Because I think that all aspects of, you have legacy systems, you have scenarios where you as an organization might sit down and say, look, what is my roadmap for FY26? What is my roadmap for the year calendar 26? Is there any critical systems that we need to think about as an aging infrastructure that we need to now embrace a change effectively to build some resiliency across that? What does it actually mean, right? And then there are challenges across that. So how do we have those conversations from bottom to top and top to bottom in the organization to have, I guess, the strategies, which then comes down to the recovery strategies of implementing effective strategies to overcome those setbacks, which is, again, embracing that change effectively, of changing that mindset. And then you've also got the role of readiness here, right? And as part of that recovery strategies, how quick can we respond? Are there interdependencies here? What are those interdependencies that we just talked about previously, and how do we make sure that if I'm reliant on sector B and C, how do we communicate and collaborate effectively that we can quickly respond and be back up and running and continue to do what we need to do, right, is to serve society, right? So those are the kind of the key principles that we should always be thinking about. What do you reckon of that, Sanjay?
Yeah, well, what you've said is pretty spot on because the mindset has to shape how we design our systems and our processes from a business point of view. And as we change our mindset, as we talk about critical infrastructure in the modern AI world, now we need to really understand what artificial intelligence is. Now, this is not a session where we're going to do a deep dive into artificial intelligence, but we're going to talk about the basics of artificial intelligence because we started this conversation about what critical infrastructure is, the interconnectedness between the critical infrastructure, the threats to those critical infrastructure, and what resilience is. So as we use those foundational knowledge, let's talk about what exactly is artificial intelligence.
Sure. You want me to tackle this one? Absolutely. It's pretty simple, right? It's yeah. So it's basically computer that is using human-like abilities for learning and problem solving, right? And giving, I guess, a position of a view that can be quite binary as well. So getting a bit of a binary analytic view across things versus the human emotional view of things are two different concepts, right? So I think it brings a little clarity on understanding what that is from a binary perspective, and just helping that, I guess, from us in our ecosystem is to work, I guess, a little smarter and better and faster than what we used to, right? And what's your view on that, Sanjay?
So we are focusing on creating machines that can think like humans, or maybe at least try to go beyond how we think as a human being.
Yeah,
And, and
absolutely.
And when you think about the goal of artificial intelligence, the goal of our AI is to mimic everything that we do as a human being. And machine is much more advanced and getting much more advanced because they are learning from the experiences. They're going to solve the problem. They're going to recognize the patterns. And this is where we talk about CCN. And those are the acronyms we'll worry about at some other stage. The machine are going to make the decisions proactively. And we have encountered AI in our day-to-day life, whether it's using Alexa, whether you are using Siri, whether you are using chatbot. There are huge opportunities that we can see with AI. But as we talk about the huge opportunities that exist because of AI, there are challenges. And we need to understand the challenges. And AI is a complicated topic. It's a big topic. But at a very, very high level, we need to understand that AI is an umbrella term. It's a broad field, which is focused on building a systems and building a smart system that can uh, behave like human beings. So these days we talk about self-driving cars. We talked about SCADA systems. We talk about ICS, industrial control systems, working in the other industries, and they all have got artificial intelligence behind it. Now, before we get into the types of different AI at a very, very high level, anything, admin, that you would like to add from an artificial intelligence point of view that are using this particular forum that would love to hear?
No, absolutely. I think you covered it. So we just need to understand this area will evolve, right? It continues to evolve rapidly. And I think systems and services and products and services across the ecosystem are building this into the context of their product suites. So it's quite interesting to know that, there is no way of walking away and being non-AI. The future is that path, and how do you utilize that to your advantage within the organization, right? In the context of critical infrastructure, what are the things that we should consider as part of this? And I think it comes down to exactly what you highlighted there is neural networks as well, right? Having an understanding of what's going on in your ecosystem and how it can help find anomalies and do things a lot quicker and faster than what we can do with eyes on glass view, right?
That's right. And when we talk about deep learning, artificial intelligence is a broader term. And as we talk about artificial intelligence, which has been in existence since, I think, the first journey, if you look into the time frame, it has started somewhere in early 1950s. And it has evolved over a period of time. Mm-hmm. And there has been a massive evolution of artificial intelligence over the last few years because of how the machine has been learning and behaving, getting deeper and deeper in terms of deep learning and using neural networks. And these neural networks are inspired by human brain. And as these machines are getting much more smarter in the critical infrastructure sector, we need to understand that machines are going to do and mimic everything that we can do as a human being using a concept called neural networks. And there are multiple types of artificial intelligence, and in the broader spectrum, the artificial intelligence systems are divided based on their capabilities and based on their functionalities. Without going into the detail in this particular forum, we are not even close to super intelligent AI. And this is where we're going to use the full potential of neural networks. We are sitting somewhere over here when it comes to narrow AI and getting into general AI. And when we talk about the machines based on their functionality, we have reactive machines. We have got machines with limited memory. And then there are some conceptual terms which is theory in the public domain at this point in time, but there is a lot of research going on in terms of moving away from the conventional way of AI into what we call it the theory of mind and AI systems which are self-aware. And that's pretty scary, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we get to understand that, right? We get to understand how that will evolve. We get to understand what are the dependencies of that when we get there, right? So I think it's very, in a position still theory-based. So when we get there, we will know.
Yeah, and think about it. I was reading an article from an Australian point of view, and there was an article which is there in the public domain, which talks about the dispatch of vehicles. So, for example, ambulances, and there was some issue with some of the systems, IT systems. There were issues, and the ambulance department they could not dispatch ambulance to the people who needed most. And it's just a simple example of how we can use AI, not just in computers and technologies and using that to use our, create our CV or create something else, but also how we can use AI in the emergency sector. And if you think about AI in the firefighting and the rescue operation, think about the world where we have got the drones, and this is not really hypothetical about what I'm going to say here. This is real. We have got drones which are doing deliveries. Think about drone which is circling on top of our head. The robots at the bottom and trying to guide the firefighters so that they can make the decisions in real time. They can go to the places and make an informed decision using the algorithm that goes behind the scene using a tool called AI. And we can optimize the dispatch of these critical people, for example, whether it's a fire, whether it's an ambulance, whether it's paramedics, they can go to the right places within a shortest amount of time, and they can find the right the right route to go to the right place at the right time rather than getting stuck in the traffic. And all because of AI.
Yes, and that's a clear example, right, of how it could benefit the use of the travel between point A and point B. The other thing in this context is you talked about there was a scenario where something happened, right? And therefore they couldn't dispatch ambulances. So what are the monitoring in place? What could AI do to help monitor those critical assets and critical dependencies to make sure that you have that and understand that, hey, look, there's an anomaly here, something's gone down. What does this mean in my interdependencies across the ecosystem for the service? Then as part of that process, you come down to point 3, which is public alert system. How can we alert everyone, hey, look, we have a situation here. We will inform you in a timely manner when we're back up and running, or we have a limited capability or limited capacity at this particular time. Please engage us this way instead of that way. So there are things to think about and put it into ecosystem as part of how you operate and continue to function, right?
Yeah, that's right. And AI can revolutionize emergency response system and making sure that we make all these decisions based on the data. Whether it's labeled data, unlabeled data, that's secondary. But the question here is, can we respond faster? Can we respond quickly so that even if there are bad players out there and malicious actors, they're trying to impact the ecosystem and impact the critical infrastructure, we have got the smartness and there is a thought leadership behind the scenes so that we can understand that we are a step ahead of those malicious actors. And that's why we need to fundamentally think about not just doing the traditional vulnerability assessment on our critical systems, which are pretty much dependent on technology, or call it cloud computing or on-prem computing, whatever that may be. So there has to be a fundamental shift in terms of how we look into vulnerability assessment. Now, we all know exactly what vulnerability assessment is. We all know exactly what penetration testing is. I was reading an article and I was watching a video from IBM Technology a couple of weeks ago. And there has been a lot of focus in terms of what is exactly fundamentally going to change in the years ahead is getting into the sophistication of called AI-based penetration testing. So there are attackers who are using AI to identify those vulnerabilities. And they are finding all these smart ways to attack systems every day and night. How can we use AI to be ahead of the game? How can we build a system which is providing continuous monitoring, and based on the information and the data that we get and we collect from all the systems, how we can make a risk-based decision? And that's where the execs they come from. And that's where the senior leadership team, the board and audit and risk committee, that's where they spend a lot of time to think about it. How long is the piece of the string? How can we fix those issues in the continuously evolving world while taking an informed and risk-based decision? Anything, Edwin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key here is cutting through the noise, right? So when there is a particular scenario when there is, a malicious actor doing something, we should be able to, from an AI perspective around the enhancements, to cut through all the noise and get down to the specifics of what's actually occurring and what is a strategic response to that as part of that continuous improvement and the continuous monitoring of that system. Then it goes back to then again, yes, risk factor and prioritization is what is the impact to the organization and what is the likelihood of that occurring, what's happening now. So we need to respond, and what does that actually mean? It comes back down to the whole process of that shift in risk assessment, which you are going to now bring up, Sanjay. So yes.
Thank you. And maybe we're reading each other's mind here, Edwin, because we talked about cutting the noise. And as we talk about noise and evolving our methodologies and processes in the advanced world where we talk about artificial intelligence, the traditional approaches are getting redundant. They are not going to be very useful, because if you see the information on this particular slide, and if I draw the line in the sand between these two types, the graph, the top part and the bottom part, this is the traditional way how we have been managing risk assessment from a critical infrastructure point of view, where we do devise and design rule set, we import the data, and we get an output. However, in the AI world, the pattern is very different. We start playing with the data, and we started playing with training data. We have got test data, and we do the validation and the cross validation using all the different technological 10-4K means, and build our AI model, which takes the data and give us the output. So the fundamental approach of cyber risk assessment is now evolving, which takes us into the next part. How do we go about risk management? And how do we do risk management in the modern world? And as we talk about risk assessment here, and we have already mentioned, Edwin, in terms of looking into the fundamental shift, through the noises, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And employee training is quite important, right? Is to understand that context, right? And to, I guess, that's one of the things around, us working together, understanding the strengths and weaknesses between the human factor and the AI factor, right? And then having, I guess, an automated instant response and a good workflow to understand what that is. And also, I think one of the things we're missing here that, one of the things we should think about is the predictive maintenance, right? That auto isolation of threats, right? And escalation workflows. So it can automatically tell us something's going on. We need to kick off a process, and then have the human person to come in the back end to say, actually, what we did and how it did it is actually absolutely aligned, right? So that also is quite a key factor around, as we talk about risk management and AI in the infrastructure, is also look at, what are the specific audits it can do for us and continue doing the self-checking on our behalf, right? And having an understanding of that, and it plays that back into the disaster recovery plan and the playbooks. So, human factor is just as important, and upskilling our employees to understand the context of AI is important too, to make sure that continuous improvement evolves.
So, Edwin, where are you coming from? If I connect all the dots, that it's not one layer when we talk about risk management. We're talking about stacks and stacks, isn't it? So,
absolutely.
As we talk about the stacks of stacks that exist, and from a critical infrastructure point of view, how we can leverage artificial intelligence to automate the incident response plan, automate the detection plan, and enable so that we can make the right informed decision while we are containing the threats. And these are some of the examples of how we can use artificial intelligence in critical infrastructure. And you have already touched base on some of the points that you have mentioned about the weakest link in the food chain. And when you mentioned about human training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most important part here is making sure that we have a defined process, right, an understanding of that. Because there is some elements of, I need to summarize something where it's beneficial for me, for key stakeholders, to execs to understand the threats that are coming through and how do we need to mitigate that, to versus binary outcomes that could tell us some anomalies that are going on. And I think it all kind of lines into a decent view of, where you have AI-powered risk assessments to understanding the training of systems, all the way down to the planning and recovery of systems, right? I guess, what would be a clear example, I'm going to go back a little bit further back into microservices architecture, right, Sanjay? So I'm sure you understand microservice architecture is that if one component fails, the second component kicks into continue to operate, right? And there are good examples of where that is. And then how does AI fit into that architecture moving forward, right? And how does it make sure that all those components of the microservices continue to do what they're doing? And then make sure that we are self-evaluating, self-testing, and self-checking those things, and utilizing the harness and the power that we've got here today is around AI and what can it do for us, right? So I think it's definitely something to consider as part of predictive analysis. There you go, moving forward, and analytics. So, alerting systems, resource optimization, identify trends is quite an important one here, Sanjay, because this could also be things around compromised accounts, right? This could be someone that's already in my network. What are they doing? So there's things associated with that we need to really think about.
Exactly. And I wish I had a crystal ball for cyber threats, and I'm not sure if any one of us has got a crystal ball who are listening to this presentation, and we have dialed into this particular session. I'm not sure about you, Edwin. Sometimes with AI is the crystal ball. I don't know what your thoughts are on AI being the crystal ball.
Yeah, look, there's thoughts across it. There is definitely scenarios of yes, it could help predict things. It could help tell us, look, there's some anomalies here that you should consider around what does it look like. So decision making, automated response, and also, I think the most important part is the step 2 for me, which is the predictive maintenance, right? It can also forecast from a perspective of, hey, look, we have a critical system here that's never had downtime for a very, very long time. It's been running for 8 years. It's about time we should consider how do we make sure that we understand that concept of not just reducing downtime, but some systems do need to reboot, right? And what is the interdependencies across the systems and services, right? So we need to also think about that. And I think decision making and threat detection is quite important. So threat detection is important, but I still feel that, improving decision making is important to understand the context of not just a binary outcome, but what are the predictiveness of something occurring again, and then having the real analysis and real-time data that it does is quite important, right? So those steps are very important as part of the ecosystem. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Sanjay?
And the system is not about just alerting, it's responding, and how it can be used to isolate any infected systems within our environment, flag any false positives, and hopefully call our boss. Maybe not the last one. Okay. So now, just keeping an eye on the time here, it's 10 minutes left in our session. Happy for people to anyone, the delegates, to ask any questions in the chat window that you have got access to, and we will do our best to answer all your questions in the 10 minutes that we have got left. And we're not able to answer your questions because if you may ask some tough questions, we are going to use AI for that. Sounds good, Edwin, isn't it? So,
absolutely.
So While I'm looking in the chat window here, as the questions are popping up, we'll continue with our conversation. And before we end today's presentation, we'll give you some takeaways based on the presentation, something that you can use in your day-to-day life from a practical point of view. And we have spent a lot of time to talk about the risks and the challenges related to AI, about what the AI is and how we can use AI in the critical environment or for critical infrastructure. And we use the example of firefighters. We use the examples from the dispatch point of view when it comes to paramedics. It does require a multi-layer defense approach, and a layered defense in today's world is not practical. Rather than saying it's not practical, it's not optional anymore. And 90% of the, are based on the stats that I had a look at, 91% of the organization these days, and this is based on Verizon's report in 2024, they suffer major breaches due to the lack of multi-layer defense system. For example, how can you use firewalls? How can you use AI models? How can you use SOAR technologies, CCTV, and how we can train all the systems so that it can inform, and not only inform, but it can take proactive measures to protect our critical assets. So let's talk about some of the key takeaways from our conversation today. And one of the areas where we struggle is regulations, and regulations are catching up. And this is a perfect timing. There is a question in the chat window, and the question, someone has asked the question, how is artificial intelligence going to impact GRC field? And it's very timely question because governance, risk, and compliance is an umbrella term. However, when you talk about governance, risk, and compliance from an artificial intelligence point of view, it's not about writing Microsoft Word document and PowerPoint presentation and get someone to come and do an audit once every 12 months. It's understanding our business objectives, understanding what exactly that we do from an organization point of view. And Edwin, you mentioned about SOC Act from an Australian government point of view. So when you talk about SOC Act, it covers even our retail organization like Woolies and Coles. Anything you would like to add to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you know, it's a great act and a great steer in the right direction. It's just that again, it comes down to the statistics we showed around 65% of non-compliance, right? And getting that view across the ecosystem is important. And I'm thinking, you know, in the context of, you know, I guess awareness in your own organization and what does that actually mean, is to have those relevant conversations to say, look, you know, we need to uplift our game here. We need to understand what is that context. We need to, you know, utilize some of the resources, the practical approaches and tools and technologies we have to understand that context a bit better so that we can help mitigate ourselves and be more resilient across the ecosystem, yeah?
That's right. And looking at some of the questions, reading some of the questions in the chat window here, there is a question around looking on the AI guardrails, which has played a crucial role in protecting protecting our organization in the real world. And someone is interested to know about how artificial intelligence could be used alongside legacy systems in critical infrastructure when they may not be compatible from a technology point of view. And that's right. And this is where Edwin has mentioned a very critical word called DID, which is called defense in depth. And when Edwin mentioned about defense in depth, in the AI world, in the presentation that we have covered so far, it is based on the layered approach. One layer, one set of control or controls is not going to be effective. And we need to think about how we leverage the act, the standards, and the guidelines. And there is an artificial intelligence standard called ISO 42001. And you can become a lead auditor, you can become a lead implementer. However, if we are struggling just to get compliant and certified on ISO 27001, we have got a lot of catching to do. And we need to take into consideration as we are building and moving forward by leveraging the standards, the regulations, and the guidelines, and take some practical approach in terms of how we can put the reliance on service providers and technology providers who are building these AI systems, but we want to make sure that these AI systems are fair and they do not have any bias. And there is a necessity for continuous improvement. And as we talk about the necessity for continuous improvement, there have been enormous amount of threats. And while we have to train everyone, we need to adopt to new technology by taking a defense in depth approach. And as we talk about defense in depth approach, and we have emphasized a lot, Adam, when you talk about human factors, isn't it? And we need to bring the human and technology together, and that's where we talk about technology and human integration.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about that capability uplift, right? And that capability uplift is quite critical to success, okay? And that ties back into things like long-term planning and engagement. It also ties into the growth over time, right? And having sure that, you have that combined effort moving forward, tech and human factors, and that integration is quite critical to utilize the things we've got today. And I think there's a few more questions. There's one around how does AI-based penetration testing compare to traditional methods, time and cost efficiency and effectiveness? Look, that's quite a critical one to understand. There is certain aspects of AI penetration testing that you would still have a human element of that, as well as in the effectiveness of the capability, right? Having both together is better than just having one of the other, right? So that whole scenario of tech and human factors integration is a key value to one of those questions asked here, right? You can use it to smartly do pen tests, but there is going to be a capability that you need in there to understand those outputs and utilize those outputs to then continue to create the defense in depth. Sanjay.
Yeah, thank you. And there is another question. What processes would you recommend for a business to see around corners of any potential unintended consequences of any leveraged use of artificial intelligence? And that's a very timely question, because in modern world, we are not looking into just building a system which are going to serve our users. In the modern world, in 2025 and beyond, we are looking into building systems which can earn their own cost. And that's a fundamental shift in the way we think about technologies these days. And we need to understand that there are going to be what I call it hidden spots. There are going to be blind spots. So in today's world, we are not just talking about shadow IT, we also started a new term called shadow artificial intelligence. And we need to understand from a business strategy point of view as how we take the methodologies, and going back to one of the previous slides here, we really need to understand what our business does, what's critical for us, because we all have got only 24 hours in a day. Unless Edwin, you've got more than 24 hours in a day. Cool.
Okay. No, 24 hours is what it is.
Yeah, we all have got 24 hours in a day, and we need to utilize the time that we have got to make sure that any effort that we are putting into place, whether it's artificial intelligence related penetration testing, whether it's building risk management methodology, or supporting our business to meet audit obligations, regulatory requirements, we need to go back to the basics to understand where we exist, what our business does, and what are the legislative and regulatory requirements we need to comply with. And as we are heading towards the end of the session, this is the final takeaway from our session. And there is people who have joined the session outside Australia or New Zealand. There is a TV show here on Channel 10 called 60 Minutes. I would encourage you to go and watch this particular video of Jeffrey Hinton. He's considered the godfather of artificial intelligence. And in the 60 Minutes interview, he talks about the hidden aspects of artificial intelligence and how fast artificial intelligence is advancing around misinformation, job disruption, and the oversight issues and the regulatory and other challenges. So definitely, please take your time to go ahead and watch this. Anything else you would like to add here, Adam?
No, I think we covered a good broad spectrum of what we are trying to achieve here is, understanding of that critical infrastructure, the outcomes of it, leveraging AI and risk management for resiliency, making sure we understand where those, pieces of the puzzle come together, and then having a look at, what does it actually mean from a strategy perspective, and how do we change our mindset moving forward, right? So I think it's been a really good discussion today.
Thank you, Admin, and that's a wrap. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us, especially if you didn't tune out at the break. So we both are real human beings, myself and Admin here, and we hope after this particular session you're going to take something back into your industry and at your workplace and use AI to make some key differences. Over to you, Gobin.
All right, thank you very much, Sanjay and Edwin, for the insightful presentation. And thank you very much to our audience for the active participation and a great set of questions. So as we conclude, I would just like to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website, and you will be informed via email once it's ready. And if you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out to PECB. So once again, Sanjay and Edwin, thank you very much. And thank you everyone who joined us today. Have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.